warm welcome. I'm Robert Taylor of the Oak Bay Heritage Foundation. Thank you again for coming on our monthly Heritage Talk. And as always, of course, we're acutely aware that where we're standing right now has been a home for people for thousands of years, who were good stewards of the landscape and connections of the first Oak Bayers. The Songhees and the Esquimalt Nation are still here with us, just a few miles away, and we respect the fact that they did live here for time immemorial, and their connections to these traditional territories to continue. The foundation is determined to, and is expanding its view of history, in that we've tended to focus on settler history. It's all around us, it's well documented, easy, but we're now going much more into the longer history of the Oak Bayers who lived here for thousands of years. So tonight, Your Worship, the Mayor is here. However, he's been pushed out of the way, apparently, by this fellow called Arifin. Now, if you don't know Arifin, Arifin is a well-known Oak Bay character. He is a genius. Arifin, the posters you see for these events, Arifin makes them. He turns our very boring annual report into a work of art. He's just an amazing, talented craftsman. So thank you, Arifin. For many, many years, he did this, pro bono. Poor guy was going broke. So we gave him so much work and we didn't pay him for it. Now we give him a miserable sum, which is a big improvement over nothing. So at this point, I'll ask Arifin to introduce Helen.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Robert. And Mr. Mayor, please forgive the usurpation was not intentional. I have to tell you that. I think you were supposed to be having a meeting this evening, and so I am here, and I really appreciate this opportunity to introduce my dear friend, Helen Edwards. I first met Helen at a Heritage Hallmark Society annual meeting some years ago, courtesy of my dear wife, Wiluya, who had met Helen there. And it's been my pleasure to work with Helen as her book designer on 5 different books so far. And over that time, she has become both a great friend and an inspiration. Growing up, Helen was shy. However, she decided at some stage to put that to one side and to become a force to be reckoned with. When she worked in the federal government here in Victoria in the 1960s, there was a group of women, including Helen, who did not want to necessarily wear skirts to work every day. They wanted to wear pantsuits. Well, a small group of them, probably led by Helen, got together and went on strike for a day. Well, guess what? They got what they wanted. And Helen is deeply committed to her community and lives by the maxim, if we all work together, we can be strong. This tonight, of course, is about sports. Helen has a lot of interest, and sports is certainly a deep one. She started her interest in sports at the age of 3, when her father, who was a prairie boy, took her to baseball games at the Royal Athletic Park. She then discovered hockey at the age of 5, when the Cougars would give the kids, she and her friends, tickets to Cougars games for 5 cents each. And tonight, of course, is all about hockey and that lifelong love that Helen has had. And the celebration of the Cougars, those very same Cougars winning the Stanley Cup in Oak Bay in March of 1925. And Helen has, I know, been a major mover and shaker of that effort. When Ron MacLean interviewed Helen on CBC TV last year during Hockey Day in Canada, and he interviewed her not for 2 minutes, but for a good 10, I would say. He called Helen a Canadian national treasure. Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the inimitable, the indefatigable, the inspiring Helen Edwards. Bless you.
I don't want to trip over cables. That would be undignified. Okay, I should be able to just speak like this. Because when I was at school, we had to learn to throw our voice from one end of an auditorium to another. So just in case microphones fail, I can talk anyhow. And I'm very pleased to be here to talk about one of my big loves, which is hockey, and to give some history, because so many people in this area don't know that we won a Stanley Cup. They don't even know we played, all the wonderful things that happened in Oak Bay. And so I'm here to set the record straight. So first game of professional hockey in Victoria was played between the New Westminster Royals and the hometown Victoria team at the new Victoria Arena on January 2nd, 1912. However, the story starts way back in Quebec. Joseph Patrick was born in 1857 in South Durham, Quebec. He moved to Drummondville in 1881, where he met school teacher Grace Nelson, and they married in 1883. Their sons, Curtis Lester and Frank, were born there. The family eventually moved to Davleyville, where Joseph formed a lumber company. Lester played hockey with the Montreal Wanderers, winning the Stanley Cup twice. In 1906, they moved to Nelson, BC, where Joseph founded the Patrick Lumber Company. The brothers played together in Nelson and led their team to victory in the Kootenay League. However, Frank had a dream of professional hockey on the West Coast. And when his father retired in 1911, selling to the British Canadian Lumber Corporation for $440,000, a lot of money in those days, he presented the idea at a family meeting. Lester wasn't quite sure if this would work, but Joseph voted in favor and the die was cast. They set up the Pacific Coast Hockey Association, and originally they were going to have 4 teams: Vancouver, Victoria, Calgary, and Edmonton. Didn't quite work out that way, but now, Patricks quickly filled their rosters for the upcoming season by recruiting from all the Eastern teams except Ottawa. Now, in 1912, newspapers didn't use team names, and it's really, the teams really didn't have official names out here. So Victoria's legal name was the Victoria Ice Hockey Club, but who's going to say, go Victoria Ice Hockey Club? But the media called them the Capitals, Lester Patrick's Puck Chasers, I like that one, and the Victorias, how original. Vancouver, they called the Terminals because of the terminal of the railway, or Vancouver's. But New Westminster was always known as the Royals for some reason. The Times newspapers started calling them the Capitals after the first season. Now, because Times and the Calder's could never do anything the same, when the colonists started calling them Capitals, the Times started calling them Senators. And the Vancouver province called the Victorian team the Aristocrats in January 1913, although Victorian newspapers stuck with older names. Eventually, the colonists and the Times actually got together and adopted the name Aristocrats in 1915. It would appear that Lester Patrick had approved of the team being Aristocrats, as that nickname was used until a final name change to Cougars in 1922. Now, the Patricks, because we don't have natural ice here, they had to build artificial rinks in Vancouver and Victoria. For Victoria, they purchased a 3-acre site near the Willows Hotel to build the Victoria building and plant for an estimated $100,000. Patrick's incorporated the Victoria Arena Company on June 8, 1911, and Lester Patrick was named manager of the team. By May, it was reported that he was not only going to make Victoria his home, but he would manage the team and play for them as well. They happened a lot in those days. You know, on August 13th, 1911, Victorians saw for the first time an architect's sketch. And I was very lucky to get access to the original blueprints at the Oak Bay Archives, and I was permitted to take pictures. Now they're being reproduced and will be on display next weekend. They were supposed to, you know, the ice surface was 210 by 85, and there was a seating capacity of 3,600 people. And they had laid the foundation, and it was a timber frame. They were working on that. The contractor said it would be ready, as well as its counterpart in Vancouver, by November 1911. Well, guess what? It wasn't, but that's nothing new. At this point, the composition of the new league had not been finalized. People suggested they had Victoria and Vancouver, of course, Calgary, Edmonton, Rosslyn, Nelson, and maybe New Westminster. In the end, the decision was made to start with 3 teams, Victoria, Vancouver, and New Westminster. The problem was New Westminster didn't have a rink yet. They hadn't built Queen's Park. So it was decided that New Westminster would play its home games in Vancouver. So essentially they had 2 rinks. Now with the new arena nearing completion, players began to arrive in the West, ready to play with their team. And excitement continued to build as the arena grew near to completion. And by the second week of December, readers were presented with a possible list of players for the new season. And I don't know if you can read all this, but they're just waxing poetic about who's going to be here. And, you know, Bert Lindsay, is Ted Lindsay's father. You know, these names, most of them are in the Hall of Fame now, but this is where it all started. And Tommy Dunderdale came from Winnipeg. He was very interesting. He was actually born in Australia, but his family moved to Winnipeg and lived there. Now this is, you know, advertisers always figure it out. There's hockey coming, yeah, let's advertise skates. So that's what they did. And here's a picture of Tommy Dunderdale in his Victoria rim. He was considered just the best player to come around because he actually was told by the association in the East that if he came out west, he'd never be allowed to play for an Eastern team again. He said, that's fine. Victoria will have the best balanced team in the league, and I'm quite happy to be here. And he's just an amazing, amazing person. He went back to Winnipeg after he finished his hockey career, and then all traces of him disappeared. So where he went, where his wife went, nobody knows. But he's in the Manitoba Hall of Fame, and they also have a trophy named after him. But imagine, coming from Australia, you know, just blows my mind. Now, this is the roster for the first game, and they didn't waste time, you know. They had the lieutenant governor dropping the puck, and, you know, some parts of the game were quite rough, and Walter Smale sustained a bad blow on the bridge of his nose after a collision. He left the ice, but returned after medical attention and continued playing. It's actually important to note that hockey in that era was much different from the modern game, as they didn't substitute players. There were 7 men to a team, goaltender, center, 2 wings, 2 defensemen, who were called point and cover point, and in between was a rover who played both offensively and defensively. And during regulation time, there were 14 men on the ice unless there were penalties. Substitutions were rare because if you left the ice, you couldn't come back. And most players were on the ice for an entire 60 minutes of a game. And if they were injured, the player was given 10 minutes to be patched up. after which time his team would carry on shorthanded if he was unable to return. And often the opposing team would reduce their squad in the interest of sportsmanship. You can't imagine that happening nowadays because it's all about money. These players played for the love of the game because they sure didn't make a lot of money. They all had other jobs. So here's ticket prices. Yeah, can you imagine getting a Canucks ticket for $2? No, but that's what they cost. And those were the expensive ones. The unreserved seats were 50 cents. And they were sold all over town. Fit Right was a clothing store, and eventually they were sold in other locations as well. Now, to put it in context, here's what other things cost. Old Dutch cleanser, 10 cents. Flour, a whole sack of flour for $1.75. Shoot, I can't buy a sack of flour now for under $15, but that's just the way things were. And so the first season wasn't that great. They had a 7-9 record, but they prepared for their second season. And this is one of the more interesting players. They called him Silent, Jack Ulrich. He was deaf, but he still managed to play the game. And he played for Victoria for a couple of years, and then actually was traded to the East because they thought his skills fitted better with their game. But just early acceptance of people with a disability could actually do something. And here's one of my prized possessions. This collection of cards never leaves my house because I'd hate to lose them because they cost me a lot of money. I could not afford the Lester Patrick one. They wanted $10,000 and I said, no, thank you. But these were put out by Imperial Tobacco because, of course, tobacco was a big sponsor in those days. And everybody smoked and drank, and it was quite a time. So here's 1912-13. They actually suspended league play after the March 7th game because Victoria had clinched the championship, and they said, why should we bother to play anymore? So in late March, they played a series against Quebec, winning 2-1, but they weren't awarded the Stanley Cup as Quebec would not agree that that series would be for the Stanley Cup. So I call it the Stanley Cup that wasn't.
Alan, is that picture inside the Patrick Arena?
Yes.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah. I was very lucky. I found somebody who was selling out a sports memorabilia store, and he had a lot of this stuff, and I paid a fair price, but nobody else has this stuff. And maybe, when I get really old, I might donate it somewhere, but for now it's in my collection. But it would have been a real coup for the Patrick family to win the Stanley Cup in 1913, but it was enough for them to know that they could beat the current cup holders and that they had won a hard-fought series against the best team in the East. So, although there were no games played during the summer, the Patricks traveled to the prairies and back east to try to secure more players. And on his return, Lester Patrick reported the formation of a hockey commission that would protect the club from being held up by its players, and at the same time made ample provisions for the safeguarding of the players. And one of the rules was that Western teams could draw from players west of Fort William, now Thunder Bay, while the NHA, which is the Eastern team at that time, could draw from east of the same city. Now the 1914 team, shown here, won the championship but lost 3 games to Toronto. In 1914-1915 season, New Westminster transferred to Portland as the Rosebuds, and the following season, Seattle Metropolitans joined the league. So there were then another team. Now, Victoria's 1915-1916 home season abruptly stopped when the military authorities took over the Victoria Arena to accommodate troops. The arena was converted to hold 2 battalions while the ice surface was made into a drill hall. This announcement meant there would be only one more home game in Victoria on February 1st, 1916, and the rest of the remaining home games would be played in Seattle. The last game of the season in Victoria, the new champions from Vancouver outplayed the home side 14-11. Both teams played very loose defensive hockey, and players took full advantage of the circumstances. Cyclone Taylor, the big star in Vancouver, had 4 goals and 4 assists for Vancouver, while Tommy Dunderdale had 5 goals and 1 assist for Victoria. Between them, the teams set a PCHA record for total goals scored in a game, eclipsing the previous mark of 17 by a wide margin. Thus, Victoria went from first place to last place in one season, winning only 4 games. The Vancouver Millionaires, seen here, led by Cyclone Taylor, won the Stanley Cup when they defeated Ottawa 3-0. So Vancouver did win a Stanley Cup, but it was a long time ago. And so, no hockey. Troops took over the arena and the surrounding area, and we remained there until the end of World War I. So, with the arena commandeered by the military, Lester Patrick had a franchise on his hands, but nowhere to play. He moved to Spokane, Washington State's second largest city. It seemed a good move at the time, given the family's connections to that part of the world and the fact that the United States was neutral at that time. It proved to be a costly move, as the game was never successful in Spokane. Now it is, but a century ago, no. So here's league play. Seattle Metropolitans won the league and played the Stanley Cup against visiting Montreal Canadiens, and this was Seattle winning the Stanley Cup. And they were the first United States-based team to win the Cup. So, you know, we have to remember 1915 Vancouver and 1917, we're coming. So, during the off-season, the league brought in new rules. They were always doing this. Frank was a genius with rules, and they included the delayed penalty so that nobody could be more than 2 men short. Because, you know, if you had a big fight or something, you'd have 2 guys skating around. That just wouldn't work. So this isn't one of the rules. It's still in effect today. And they also changed how the playoffs would be, and just generally did a bit of housekeeping. As I say, Frank was a genius. The Millionaires went on to Toronto to play the arenas for the Stanley Cup, but they lost. Now, but hockey returned to Victoria after the war. And in early October 1918, league officials met in Seattle to discuss hockey for the upcoming season. There were 4 teams represented: Victoria, Vancouver, Seattle, and Portland. Now, there was some concern about the number of hockey players still overseas, but they felt that the huge crews of shipbuilders working for the war effort would support hockey. And they didn't know if the arena would be okay, but by October 27th, Lester Patrick announced that although it had been shut down for almost 3 years, he would have it refurbished and open for skating, likely in early December. And this was not just a rink for hockey. There was, or professional hockey, there was merchants hockey. Every business had a hockey team. There was women's hockey, there was kids hockey, they had skating performances. It was just a real community hub. So Portland dropped out, Victoria was in, and it would be back to being a 3-team league. And Vancouver's arena would be opened as soon as the flu epidemic subsided and the closing order was rescinded. Sort of like we just had a few years ago. History does repeat itself. So Portland players were made available to the Victoria team, and of course Lester Patrick started to negotiate. And the first players to skate in an exhibition game were Lester Patrick, Debbie Kerr, and Bobby Genge. They were joined, now you have to remember these names because they're going to play, a lot of them play an important part later. Clem Laughlin, Moose Johnson, Charlie Tobin, and Tommy Murray arrived on Christmas Day, with Tommy Dunderdale and Alf Barber the next day. Skinner Poulin made an appearance on December 27th, and Eddie Oatman, who had been ill, was expected to be released from the hospital soon, and of course expected to play right away. Then they opened the sale of season tickets. So here we are. Hockey returned to Victoria January 3rd, 1919. And when I was writing my book, there were no statistics like this, so I created them. It helps to have a son who is a professional statistician who was able to help me. Now we have in their statistics for every game played in Victoria. They didn't really have a very good season. They were 7-13, but that's okay. And then in 1919, Mickey Ian, who refereed every game for many years. He was an amazing person. He is in the Hall of Fame as well. And he chose an all-star team for the league. And he's got a few here. And let's say, look closely at these names. Some would later make history with Victoria, although they weren't playing here then. So the league playoffs, second place Seattle beat Vancouver in a 2-game total point series that gave the Metropolitans the right to host the Stanley Cup final that year against Montreal. The series was sitting with 2 victories for each team and 1 tie that was suspended, as so many players on both teams had influenza. 5 Montreal players were so sick from the flu they could not play, and Corbeau was injured, so he couldn't play either. Montreal manager suggested that gaps in the Montreal lineup could be filled by players from Victoria, but Seattle didn't like that idea. So for the first time, there was no Stanley Cup champion, and the cup holder remained the Toronto Arenas, who had won the year before. On April 5th, the true tragedy of the series was revealed when it was announced that Montreal defenseman Joe Hall had died in hospital. The remaining players who had been struck by the disease all eventually recovered, but it took some time. The deadly disease that had killed tens of millions of people around the world had a terrible impact on 1919 Stanley Cup playoffs. So they have to, so pretty well, the team was awful, so they had to start rebuilding, revitalizing. And in those days, if you could imagine, a contract is 1 page, and he sends it out to the players, and they send back a telegram saying, I accept. None of this, this pages and all this stuff we have now. Very, very simple. They weren't making a lot of money, but they're playing because they love the sport. And so the first player to arrive was Moose Johnson, who is a real character. We'll talk more about him later. And Heck Fowler and Wilf Laughlin, Clem Laughlin, who will play a big role later. And then former Toronto player Harry Meeking arrived as well. Now, 1919-1920 season was without a doubt the closest finish in league history. Seattle had 12 victories, Vancouver had 11, and Victoria had 10. So they finished out of the playoffs again, but that's okay. There was always rebuilding. I think I've heard that from a team in Vancouver for the last 50 years. But, they played the Stanley Cup that year in Ottawa, but the ice was too slushy, so they had to move it to Toronto. And here we go. Now, there's always coincidences in your life. This is my father-in-law, Dutchie Edwards' journal. And when he died, we found all these journals that he'd written while he was covering the period 1916 up to 1929. And I'm going through this, and eventually wrote 2 books about him, but here it is. He says, saw a hockey match in PM, Seattle versus Victoria. Victoria won 2-0. Very good game. Fredrickson is wonderful player. Yeah, he was. He knew hockey talent. So in the Olympic Games in Antwerp, Belgium, the Winnipeg Falcons won the hockey championship and the gold medal, with Icelander Frank Fredrickson as the star of the tournament. And Lester Patrick spent considerable effort persuading Fredrickson to turn pro and join the team. Local fans got a Christmas present when he did sign a contract. He brought with him youth, speed, and terrific hockey ability, as well as a brilliant war record as a flyer. And this would be a critical signing for the club. Just all of a sudden people were getting excited about this team. And Clem Laughlin, whom many people do not know, was from Viking, Alberta, and he was the inspiration for the Sutter family. There would not be 6 Sutters in the NHL without Clem Laughlin as an inspiration. And he kept in shape on his farm, as did many of these players. And Moose Johnson, who was one of the best defensemen of the era, said, I started with you and I know who I'll finish with. And this was, considering they'd had a pretty bad record, this was a pretty good endorsement. And they had a really good team. And here's Moose Johnson night. 500 fans, newspaper boys, they stood in line for free tickets, and they were given free tickets. And it was a game for the ages. They started with presentations to Moose Johnson, and the kids gave him a present that said, presented to Ernie Moose Johnson by his pals, the kids of Victoria. And then, they went to start the game. Nope. Somebody came out and gave him cufflinks from the fans of Victoria. And then there were Cupid ladies. I don't even know what they were. Oh, they were a hockey team. And they presented Moose with a big Cupid doll. And somebody brought out a big birthday cake. And the new police commissioner did a skating act on the ice and gave a bouquet of flowers to Mrs. Moose. Now, game didn't start well as Seattle scored the first 2 goals, but they rallied, and guess what? It went to overtime. First overtime solved nothing, nor did the second. They played a 3rd overtime period. Remember, they're playing the entire game. At that point, managers of both teams agreed to call off the game with the understanding we'd play it again if it would make a difference in the final league standing. It was the longest game ever played in the Pacific Coast Hockey Association, and perhaps, until a few years ago, it was the longest in professional hockey. And Victoria had played in 4 longest games in history, and they'd won 3 and tied 1 of them. So it was, I can't imagine playing the equivalent of 2 hockey games. That's the way it was. Okay, here's the end of the 1919-1920 season. Vancouver visited Victoria, and here were the 2 stars, Cyclone Taylor from Vancouver and Fredrickson from Victoria. Well, Cyclone Taylor scored 3 goals, but Fredrickson had 3 goals and 2 assists. And guess what? The Cougars missed the playoffs again, but what else is new? We're getting used to this. Now, the major rule change for the 1921 season involved the awarding of a penalty shot if the player were fouled when he had a clear scoring chance. Now, not like the penalty shot now where they get the puck at center ice. They painted 3 dots on each end of the the rink 35 feet from the net, and the player would shoot from one of those dots. And the first penalty shot in history was scored by Tommy Dunderdale on December 12, 1921. That season, there were 98 attempts, of which only 28 ended up in the net. They made another change to the rules. They said, we're only going to play one overtime period, because they felt that the 3 overtime game played the previous season had such an effect on the players. It took them days to recover, and that wasn't good for their health, or actually the game itself. So that's when the 1 point for a tie came into being. Now here we're getting close to the good stuff. Here's Harold Slim Halderson. He was a former Winnipeg teammate of Frederickson. He was a marvelous stick handler and young. You see, they're moving younger, and that's been good. And just, season wasn't that great, but you could see it was coming. And this team actually did produce. So in 1922, they had a contest to actually name a Cougar, the team, the Cougars. And I love this quote. And who is it that said it? Some famous person said it. Anyhow, I mean, it took a sober man half an hour to get his tongue around. I just thought that was so perfect. And also in that season, they eliminated the position of rover. So now there was no more 7-man-a-side hockey. And this was 11 years after it had been dropped in the East. All games would now be played 6-man hockey, and 2 clubs changed their name. The Millionaires became the Maroons, and the Aristocrats, of course, were called the Cougars. And this, you can see how hockey is growing in the West, because this league was now playing an interlocking schedule with games from the Western Canada League, Edmonton, Calgary, Regina, and Saskatoon, who were playing outside on real ice, which made sometimes the games a little interesting. But, just, it was setting the stage for what was to come. And no, we didn't win that year either. But Ottawa Senators won that year. But they did an analysis of the interlocking schedule, and it showed that the West Coast had won 15 out of 24 games. The Cougars had 6 victories in the 8 games they played. You realize they're traveling by train, which is a lot. It's slow. No airplanes in those days. So, and sometimes the ice was really slushy. But that's okay. They wanted to have it across Western Canada. So for 1923-24, Lester Patrick brought in several players to try for the backup positions, because they were now going to change during the game. And he said he couldn't guarantee anybody would make the team even if they had a signed contract. So this is getting close to what they do now. And he wanted a younger team because he thought they could be better equipped to handle the travel and the rough play. And so they actually held a practice on November 5th, and Clem Laughlin was named the new captain of the Cougars, and Frank Frederickson was the vice captain. And Harold Hart, he was named one of the permanent team, and that left 4 players trying to get the last spot. Now, here we go again. Despite the early season optimism, team failed to make the playoffs, and disappointed local fans once again. This is a recurring theme, folks. The record after hockey had returned to Victoria after World War I had not been great, but players who had been added over the ensuing seasons made the team a formidable opponent eventually. Clem Laughlin was added in 1918-19, Harold Meeking and Frank Frederickson in 2020-21, Slim Halderson joined the team for 21-22, and Jocko Anderson the following year. Before the 1923-24 season, Harold Hart and Happy Holmes, who was a goaltender who wore a hat because he had a bald spot. And people would throw things at him because he had a bald spot. People were nasty. They threw eggs and all sorts of stuff. And 1925, they had Frank Foyston, Gord Fraser, and Jack Walker. The one constant through all this was Lester Patrick, who'd been there from the beginning. Now, little did they know that, there were going to be big changes coming. They sold the Seattle, demolished the Seattle arena. So guess what? The team had nowhere to play. So they actually merged the two leagues and was called the West Coast Hockey League. And the idea would be that all these teams would play together. It was no longer just interlocking games. It was one big league. And they would play, this winner of the championship would advance to the Stanley Cup playoffs that were going to be played in the West. And Seattle players became available to other teams, and guess what? Victoria got Frank Foyston, Gord Fraser, and Jack Walker, making a big difference. And there's Happy Holmes. Now, you can't see, but there's a bald spot on the back. And he almost, this is the one picture I've seen of him where he doesn't have a hat. I mean, other than when he was playing goal. But and the schedule was grueling because it was, games on consecutive nights, train trips in between. And of course, on paper, the Cougars looked very strong. But as we know, teams can seem ready for a championship, but always something goes wrong. But they finished third in the league with a 16-12 record. Now, they beat Saskatoon, secured a spot in the league final against Calgary. They won that. And just fans were just fervent because they could see they were actually going to win something. So they went, played in Calgary and tied 1-1 at the first game. So obviously the winner of the next game would be the league champion. They jammed 4,000 people into that arena. That's in the days when you could have standing room only and the fire department didn't come around and check. And they actually did a broadcast because they realized how many people would be disappointed not to hear the game. And so, Fletcher Brothers, which was a music store downtown and furniture, they broadcast the radio station CFCT, and the details were transmitted by wire, and then Times sports reporter Archie Wills was the announcer. So people could listen to this, and I mean, what do I do now? I listen to hockey games because I don't have to watch, I can listen, because I get a good imagination. Now here's advertising again, Plimley's, where I bought my first car ages and ages and ages ago. But here again, they're taking advantage of the situation to sell their stuff. Look at this, you can buy a car for $675. You can't even buy tires for $675 anymore. But, the funny thing was that there were wild claims made. Oh yeah, Montreal was expected to win in 3 games as their players had far more experience. Yeah, sure. However, championships are won on the ice, not off. And March 21st, they played the first game under Western rules, and the Cougars won 4-2. And Walker and Henderson scored first period goals. Walker added a second in the second period, and the third period featured 2 Cougar goals by Fraser, singles for Montreal from William Couteau and Howie Morenz. The Canadiens seemed confused by Cougar players changing lives on the fly, as we did in the West, not waiting for a stoppage in play as they did in the East. Second game was played in Vancouver, and they used Eastern rules. So you would assume Montreal would have the advantage. No. Cougars prevailed before the largest crowd to ever watch a game in the Denman Street Arena. Walker and Frederickson scored in the first period. Aurel Joliet scored in the second to make the score 2-1, but Walker found the back of the net in the third for a 3-1 victory. Now, coming home with a 2-0 lead in the series, Cougars still realized they had some work to do. Although the match was played under Western rules, Montreal changed their strategy and used 3 defensemen to beat the Cougars at their own game. Technique worked, if temporarily, and Howie Morin scored 3 goals. Joliet added 1 to lead Montreal to a 4-2 victory. Yeah. Game 4 was the deciding game in the series. Determined to win the cup for Victoria, the team skated rings around their opponents, passed the puck with great skill, and dominated in all phases of the game. And this is a reproduction of a program. I wish I had an original, but the best I've got is reproduction. And Frederickson scored in the first period to give Victoria the lead. Hart added 1 early in the second. After the Canadiens scored, Halderson and Foyston scored again for Victoria. And here is an actual ticket, which never leaves my house either. But you can see it's got the date and the score on it. Third period, Cougars kept on the pressure, adding goals by Frederickson and Laughlin to skate to a convincing 6-1 series. And here's a souvenir stick they gave out. It's very small. It's like the little sticks they give out. It's about this big. That doesn't leave my house either, because they're not making those anymore. And the news spread throughout the city, and there was a council meeting at Victoria City Council, and somebody came and whispered the score, and they interrupted the meeting to give the score that the Cougars, and the news that Cougars had won the Stanley Cup. And this is the banner headline from the Colonist, and they honored them with a civic banquet with about 300 people in attendance. But there are no big payoffs, no great presents, no. Now, thing was, it was finally time for Joseph Patrick, Lester's father, and the man who had financed the original teams, to address the crowd. And he had been an alderman at the city for quite some years. He said, "I never played hockey, but I've been closely following it, pretty closely, for 33 years. And I want to say I've never seen a smoother machine than that which Victoria has had this year. And more than all that, they are the cleanest bunch I have ever seen. They have played the game and proved that rough tactics are not essential to success." He's a little bit biased, but, and here they are, just like this. And this is their official thing. And there's Happy Holmes in the center there with his hat on. And this is, this is when they got all dressed up in suits. I guess hockey players do that all the time, but little did local fans know, but 1925-26, team would play the last professional games in Victoria for a while. Although the team was successful and again played for the Stanley Cup, losing to the Montreal Maroons, became evident that the National Hockey League had owners who were millionaires who could pay huge salaries and draw crowds to their much larger buildings. Western clubs were usually locally owned with small budgets and weren't able to pay inflated salaries. But still, this is a lineup for a game in 1926. Now, here we go. As a result of all this pressure, I know it's hard to read, but that's the best I can get. They disbanded the league, the teams were sold, and the players were dispersed. On May 1st, Victoria fans learned their team had been sold to the new franchise in Detroit for $100,000. And that team would play the following season as the Detroit Cougars. And in the newspaper it said, How did this ragamuffin bunch ever win a Stanley Cup? They're awful. That was a quote in one of the newspapers. I wish I could find it now, but it's just funny. But Lester Patrick moved to New York to run the Rangers franchise there. And although the Patricks no longer controlled hockey on the West Coast, their contributions to the game would never be forgotten. With the sale of their teams, they barely broke even on their hockey experiment. But looking back over a century later, we realized they had laid the foundation for the hockey of the future. Their revolutionary ideas seemed strange to some owners, but the NHL eventually adopted most of their rules. And Lester Patrick would coach the Rangers until 1939, although he made his home in Victoria, this home on Linden Avenue, and died here on June 1st, 1960. Little did the Cougars know they would go down in history as the last non-NHL team to win the Stanley Cup and the last non-NHL team to play in the Stanley Cup series. They were also the last West Coast team to win the Stanley Cup until Anaheim did it in 2007. Now, of course, this is what happens to wooden buildings. The arena was tragically burned to the ground on Sunday, November 10th, 1929, and several adjoining residences and a store were also destroyed. Lost in the conflagration was a collection of early hockey photographs and records from the early days of hockey in Victoria. The Wall of Fame with its photos not only of Victoria's teams, but also the teams they had played over the years, and Lester Patrick's personal records, including the activities of the teams and the league since 1911. They're gone, can never be replaced. Now, there've been other teams in Victoria. The Cubs, yeah, they've only lasted for 2 years because they started in 28. Arena broke down in 29. That was pretty well the end of them. Now, there were the Cougars that came back in the 50s. Lester Patrick owned them, even though he was in New York, and they did win a league championship. And then there's the Maple Leafs, my favorite team, of which there are very few remaining now. They played here in the 60s and won a championship, the Lester Patrick Cup. And the good old Salmon Kings, which is sort of the reason I wrote the book in the first place, because they got disbanded in 2011. And defenseman Billy Schvatz, who had played for the Victoria Maple Leafs and lived in Victoria, he died about the same time. And I said, okay, if these stories are gone forever if somebody doesn't tell them. So I spent 7 years researching it to tell them. And I don't regret any of that time. May 25th, 2001, local citizens erected a monument to commemorate the Stanley Cup win. It sits on the grounds of Oak Bay High School, across the street from the original Patrick Arena site, now the site of the Canmore Apartments. And this has been completely refurbished and will be part of our centennial celebrations in a week. Now, yeah, I know, I'm a media forward, here. But a century later, we will commemorate the 1925 victory with 2 days of family activities centered around the Oak Bay Rec Center. And on Sunday, March 30th, there'll be a small cavalcade starting at the Oak Bay Arena, finishing at the Rec Center. There'll be a double-decker bus which will carry former professional players and other dignitaries. Stanley Cup will be there, and the Vancouver Canucks van will be there, and mascot. So visitors will be able to have their photos taken with a Stanley Cup, skate on both real and artificial ice, and view historic displays, including my stuff. So while we are celebrating history, we will focus on younger players. And all the proceeds from the sale of our equipment will go to support the Cornwall Society for Mental Health. And we are also taking up collections to support minor hockey. It's going to be just so much fun. I tell you, by the time it's over, I'm going to be exhausted. But if you want any information, it's all here on our website. And it's just going to be a wonderful celebration, celebrating Oak Bay, because that's where it all happened. And, you know, I will be selling my book. I have a few tonight. They're also available in the Scotiabank, in Oak Bay, at Ivy's, and at other bookstores. But I'll be selling them at the event, and they're $50, and all proceeds are donated to Canuck Place Children's Hospice, because that's my favorite charity. And that's how Victoria went from nothing to winning a Stanley Cup. And you know something, they can never take that away from us. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Probably like many people here, although I was aware of this, I was aware of the cup and the arena burning down, I had no idea of this level of interest. And thank you so much for capturing history. If we don't capture it, you save it, it vanishes. So you saved it. I'm glad the book is there, because that's our draw prize tonight. So everyone who has a ticket, hold on to them. It's not quite 8 yet, so before we start the refreshments, any burning questions anyone would like to ask Helen? You were too good.
I spent 7 years researching this.
And we can see, sorry, the question over
But
there.
Russ has to have a question.
Are there any Patrick descendants left in Victoria?
Yes, I talked to one when we had the official launch of our event. Yeah, and yes, right there. Oh, there's 2 of you. Okay, I only knew about you. Okay, but yes, there are still Patrick descendants, and yeah.
The question, 2 questions over there.
Yeah, my question is, in terms of the era of those teams, did it draw capacity crowds most of the time or not?
Yes, yeah, it became the place to go, because not only did they have the hockey, they had skating exhibitions in between periods. None of this stupid games with, you know, trying to ride a tricycle or something. No, they brought in professional trick skaters. They had bands playing. It was a real community event. Yeah, and they drew very, very well. Still didn't make any money, but then what else is new?
Yes, sir.
How long did Lester Patrick play?
Well, he went to New York just to be the manager, but one day at age 44, they needed a goaltender, so he strapped on the pads and went in and won the game. So, you know, you wouldn't do that anymore, but it just makes such a wonderful story. And I think what's nice about him is he never forgot Victoria. He always came back in the summertime and and I was in that house because the people that were living in it when my kids were in preschool, they were in preschool too. So I was in the house, but I didn't know it was Lester Patrick's house at the time. So I didn't really have a good look. Now I wish I had, but you know. Yeah, it's just down the street from my house, so.
I have one last question over there, sir.
Why was the arena built in Oak Bay and not downtown?
Because it's where they could find the land. And,
The exhibition grounds were very close to it as well.
well, yes, exactly, because there was the Willows Hotel, because Oak Bay was a big destination in those days. And downtown was, maybe.
Was Buzz Patrick or that, was he Lester's son? Or
Yes, yeah, yeah.
He just had the one son then, or?
No, Muzz and, my brain's gone dead. Lynn and Muzz, and they're both in the BC Sports Hall of Fame too, so, yeah, it's just, you know, and it happened here, and I think that's what people don't know, and,
Okay, one more last question.
Any idea what a hot dog and a beer would have cost in the arena?
an awful lot less than they cost now.
So what should we do now? Before we break, of course, for our refreshments, we have the draw. And ask Helen to draw the winning tickets for a $50 book And don't forget, we'll close the sound auction in about 15 minutes and also give a couple of minutes warning for the opportunity to buy those incredibly valuable hat and jersey. So don't forget that. And the winning ticket is, last three numbers, 971.
Oh my God.
971.
And she's a volunteer next year.
Oh, yeah.